here. It's really exciting to do one of these in person again. I did keep them going last year, but they were all totally on Zoom. So Sheila she's currently president of the Institute of Physics as of last month.
1st of October.
She's a former chief scientific advisor for Scotland. She's been involved with gravitation research for all her academic career. So a really fascinating person to have here. Thank you for coming. Sheila was just saying it's only the second trip she's done, so I'm very honoured she chose to come to Churchill for this event. So I guess let's go back to what turned you into a physicist. So you grew up in Dumfries but did not have scientific parents.
That's right. So I'm from the southwest of Scotland. Again, some people may not know the geography well. So Dumfries is the sort of county town in the southwest of Scotland. It's about, I guess, 30 to 40,000 population. And my father's family were from Glasgow. My mother was from Dumfries. And I grew up there with parents, neither of whom were scientists, but I think my father in particular was very interested in science and interested in physics. From a particular perspective, I think that's partly a reflection of when he grew up. Okay, he was born in 1922, and so I was old enough, just the right age to be called up actually. He fought in the Second World War and kind of came of age in a time sort of lived through the 40s and 50s, sort of after the war, when we kind of had the atomic age, when technology and science, when you look back and you look at some of the newsreels and the sort of advertising footage even from that era, and the promotion of science, of improving people's lives and physics too, that he was very influenced, I think, by that, and thought that if you were going to be a scientist, that physics was a great thing to do. He himself, wasn't a scientist. Again, he was called up just at the age when he could have perhaps gone to university and just had no taste for it by the time he came back. Yeah. Understandably, time had moved on. So I think when I was very small, too small to know, I think, they were influencing me. That was kind of the atmosphere I grew up in, that was an interesting thing to think about and to do.
And so that would have been more, if you like, conversation. But what about toys? I'm always fascinated by how parental toy choices affect children.
So that's a really interesting one, actually. When I was always keen on making things, but I actually was shepherded towards the socially acceptable making things for girls.
Dolls.
So there was a lot of, not so much dolls, but paper craft, okay. Whereas I could see the shed and with the hammer and the sort of nails, and I thought that would be kind of cool, and I was just kind of diverted away from that. So I was always interested in making things, but was diverted to the socially acceptable forms of that.
Wasn't Lego socially acceptable?
So there was a bit of Lego in the house, a bit of Lego in the house. But sort of, crafts, that sort of thing, which is strange in a way, given again the sort of the steer around science. Again, not always overtly, but the other thing I would say was that my mother, again, who was born in 1930, again, when she grew up in an era where when you got married, you had to stop work. Again, socially, that was the pressure. And so she consciously, I'm sure, spent a lot of time as a child influencing me with a very clear message, which was you can do anything you want to. Whatever you set your mind to, if you work hard, you could do anything. Yeah. And I was small and I didn't know any better, and I'd never heard any other message, so I kind of believed her because that's what children do.
Yes, I mean, so my mother, born in 1925, her parents wouldn't encourage her to go to university because she was a girl. Absolutely determined, my sister and I would go to university if we could. And so that was certainly a message I got, but my mother absolutely didn't push me in the direction of physics because she had no idea what physics was.
So it's interesting. I mean, my mum certainly, I know she would have supported anything, whatever I had chosen. But I think the seed for physics was planted by my dad. But I was interested in a range of things. I was a voracious reader, and I still am, love books. And so actually the first thing I think I wanted to be as a child was a journalist. I thought that, again, it was such an interesting profession, the writing as a profession. But by the time I got, again, quite young, to the end of primary school or so, I'd weighed it up in the balance, and I think this is kind of strange when you think back to the times it was. So we're talking, I guess, the late 70s, early 80s. I actually thought physics was so cool, and I'm not really sure where I got that idea from. I couldn't think of a more exciting, glamorous thing to do than be a physicist, which is not the traditional image, and I really don't know where I got that from. But I did. I just thought, what could be cooler than trying to figure out the universe? Where did we come from? Where did it all come from? These big questions.
Well, I find it interesting that you even knew that was physics at primary school. Because,
yes.
I mean, at my primary school, we got nature study. We didn't get anything else. I'm somewhat older than you, so...
To be honest, I'm not sure myself. I mean, being a big reader, I was quite a science fiction fan, and a big Arthur C. Clarke fan. Some of his books, again, I found, obviously science fiction, but the science bits of them were quite gripping. So I did have an idea of, I clearly didn't totally understand what physics was, but I knew that people spent their lives trying to, study the stars, understand, how big is the cosmos? If you set off, in a thought experiment in a rocket, how far could you go? Where would you get to? And that there weren't really easy answers to those questions, but they seemed to me important questions. And the idea that you could spend your life studying those things, I thought was fantastic. And I rationally had that thought that if I'm going to spend my time doing something, trying to study those sorts of things, I thought would be a fine use of my time.
And secondary school did not put you off? You had good teaching, and no one said, oh, you're a girl, you're not going to do physics?
I did not have that experience in secondary school, actually. My teachers were supportive, and I enjoyed physics, enjoyed physics, maths, and again, I knew that if I wanted to go to university and study physics, which was where I was intent on going, those were the core subjects to study. I also, though, studied, French and English, and and enjoyed those, but I was pretty clear, what I was targeted towards.
And it's interesting, because people always say, to me, why did you become a physicist? What made you like it? And I didn't get any idea of physics till I was about 13, and then I just fell in love with it. And people say, why? And I haven't a clue. It just made sense of the world to me.
I think that's right. And, thinking back, it's satisfying in that, and I think this is probably a personality thing, that in physics there are answers. There is an answer. Physics and maths, the concepts are challenging, but there are deterministic sort of outcomes, as long as we're not talking quantum mechanics or something very fuzzy, and that's satisfying to reach an understanding of something. And that comes, in simple ways, when you're at school and you've solved a problem, and there's the satisfaction of that. Yeah. And it's really the same satisfaction when you're a scientist in a lab and you've been puzzling away at a problem, and suddenly you realise what the answer is, and that you have understood something new for the first time, and you might be the first person. It might not even be a big thing, but the sheer satisfaction of seeing the pieces of the puzzle come together.
Absolutely. Though I'm quite nervous about people who talk about science in terms of Eureka moments, because not really like that.
No, but the satisfaction is there of having made a step.
Yeah, absolutely. So you went from Dumfries to Glasgow.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the people I've interviewed in previous conversations was Jocelyn Bell-Burnell, who had a hard time at Glasgow University studying physics. I mean, she talked about it frequently, about being catcalled. I think there were 2 women in her physics class, if I remember, and being catcalled every time they walked into the lecture. And just sounded, well, irritating apart from anything else, but also a bit depressing.
Yes.
You didn't have that experience.
Not that experience, no. Again, in very different numbers. When I was an undergraduate at Glasgow and I did a straight physics degree, I think about 25 to 30% of the class were women. So quite a different experience. One of a number of women studying either straight physics or physics and maths, physics and chemistry. Quite a few. And there have always been more, I think, women studying astronomy.
Yes.
Interestingly.
Yes. But you didn't do an
Nope.
astronomy course.
Experimental physics, straight physics. Yeah.
And that was a conscious choice?
It was. Interestingly, and I'm not really sure why, physics, I think it's because astronomy is very much the study of the heavens, whereas I was interested in physics in the sort of deep sense from particle physics through everything, all the fundamentals. And so physics, I felt, covered all of that. And I knew I wasn't going to be a theoretical physicist. And I think that's partly to do with the way I felt I think, which is quite pictorial. So it wasn't the maths that was the attraction for me. It was the physical intuition and the physical understanding. So experimental physics was where I was headed.
So when did you fall into astronomy and gravitational waves?
So I did a summer project, and I think it's something that is great for undergraduates to do. We still offer summer projects between typically the penultimate and final years of the undergraduate degree, where the different research groups will take on for, say, 6 or 8 weeks an undergraduate and set them to work on a research project. And I joined what was then the Gravitational Waves group in Glasgow, and I just got hooked at that point, because I discovered an area where you could work in a laboratory and you could work, and there were tabletop experiments that you could do. You were part of a bigger group of people, so it was a research group, and in our case, that research group was connected to other groups around the world. So you were part of a community. You could do something there and then that was contributing, though, to a bigger picture. And again, for folks who don't know, gravitational waves were predicted by Einstein in 1916, I think, in his general theory of relativity. Tiny changes in the gravitational field caused by things like stars colliding far out in the universe, predicted to exist, but no one had ever been able to detect them. Being able to detect them would give us a completely different way to study the heavens. And so for me, this was, I thought this was so cool, that you could be in Glasgow, in the lab, working on experiments that would contribute to this grand goal of answering, one of Einstein's last predictions.
And what could you do in 6 weeks to contribute to that?
Well, I'm not sure I really contributed very much in my 6 weeks, but I was made to feel like I could, and I think that's the important thing, to feel that being part of an endeavour. So I spent 6 weeks, if I remember correctly, working on a little tabletop Michelson interferometer, and I've forgotten exactly what the project was, but I learned a bit more about optics and interference and the sorts of techniques that actually go into building what were eventually the big observatories. But it was the hook of being part of a team that was working on a goal bigger than ourselves.
So that hooked you into your PhD, presumably?
It did. At that point, I decided that I wanted to do a PhD, stay in Glasgow, and at that point, there was no option in our field. Again, now gravitational waves, there are multiple groups in the UK who are working in this area on experimental work, many groups around the world. At that point in the UK, there really wasn't anywhere else. We were a bit of a fringe activity, I think it's fair to say. Not everyone believed that this was ever going to work because the experimental challenge was so high. And actually, for many years, there was debate in the theory community about whether these predicted signals were real even if we built our experiments, were we ever going to see anything? So it turns out early on, and I realised quite early on that there were many disbelievers out there who thought this was a complete waste of time, that we would never see anything. But I looked around me and I made a judgment. I looked at the people I was working with, and they seemed like smart people to me. They were collaborating with people at other good universities, Caltech, MIT. They seemed to believe that this was a useful thing to do, and so I thought, well, you know, I'm going to make the judgment that it's worth it. But it was not by any means a mainstream activity back then.
And did people try to put you off doing it then?
They did, sometimes quite overtly. I remember as a first-year PhD student going to a summer school with all the first-year students in astronomy, an introductory summer school, and at one of the dinners, before I'd even started my PhD at this point, I mean, this is the summer before you start your PhD, sitting next to one of the helpers at the summer school, a postdoc in astronomy, who started to ask me what was I going to work on, what was I going to do. When I explained, he kind of got increasingly aggressive in his opinions that this was a waste of time, and eventually one of the lecturers at the school stepped in and said, well, actually, he thought, you know, and that kind of smoothed it down. But, you know, that was my introduction, was the realization that I had made a choice that not everyone thought was a good thing to do.
Do you think that is character building?
I think so. I think it has to be. Sometimes one feels one's character has been built enough, and you know, one's soul is well enough developed that it doesn't need any more suffering. But I think it forces you to think hard about what you're doing and think about why you're doing what you're doing. If other people are not supportive, and you have to be able to defend what you're doing. And literally, of course, in many countries, your PhD viva is your PhD defense. So being able to explain to people why what you are doing is important, why you've chosen to do it, that's a skill, and one that scientists, if they want to succeed on the whole, have to develop. So I think, yes, character building it probably was.
And presumably that also ultimately came in useful when you were CSA, the soundbite in the lift that people always talk about, that you've got your MSP's attention for 30 seconds.
I think, and it is a skill to be able to explain, and we should be able to explain why we do what we do and why is it important. Yes.
So you stayed with Gravitational Waves. You stayed right through till the time when finally the naysayers had to shut up.
I did. I've never escaped, and I've never regretted it. It's been, you know, in many ways, it's been a sequential journey from, you know, early on deciding, you know, the field that physics was where I wanted to be. And I've been very fortunate. Not every scientist gets to go from that early aspiration right through their entire career to the point where they see the return. Mm-hmm. And so I've been very, very lucky to do that, although with some twists and turns along the way.
Would you like to tell us about your twists and turns?
Well, so I did my PhD in Glasgow, and after that, actually was lucky at the end of my PhD. I gave a talk. I gave a 5-minute talk, and that 5-minute talk changed the course of my career, I'm 100% sure. And again, back in those days as a student, you typically got the opportunity to attend one international meeting. That was where you could present your work. And I went to a meeting that happened to be hosted by Stanford University, and gave my 5-minute talk, and 3 minutes of slides and 2 minutes for questions. And you'd think, that's such a small amount of time. What usefully can you do in that time? And I always say to students, if you get an opportunity, if it's a poster, if it's a talk, go and give the talk. So I gave my talk, which was not such a fantastic talk. However, one of the members of the group there who were interested in working in gravitational waves had come to my talk, heard my talk. They were working on similar things, actually with better results than I certainly had. And he came up at the end of the talk and said, you know, we've got experience in that area. Would someone from Glasgow like to come and spend some time working with us? And, you know, I was there, my PhD supervisor was there, we said yes. And I got to go and spend 4 months in Stanford. And it was interesting. They were interested in collaborating, not so much with me, but with the group that I had been working with, which, as I say, was the only group in the UK really doing experimental work and had been for a long time, so it was well known. Stanford wanted to, you know, collaborate, and the best way to do that is through exchange of people. So I spent 4 months in the Bay Area, worked on a project and loved it, absolutely loved it. Came back after that to Glasgow, having had a fabulous experience and exposure to a different way of working in a different lab. And spent some time back in Glasgow. Then a position opened up, a postdoc position in Stanford, which was a split position in the end. And I really, looking back, can't believe I did this, but I spent 3/4 of my time in California in the lab in Stanford and 1/4 of my time in Glasgow. And I did that for 5 years and literally commuted back and forward between, I was young and apparently didn't need nearly as much sleep then as I do now. And that was a phenomenally productive time working between those two places. Lots of challenges, working for, you know, professors in both places. So I spent a lot of time learning how to have both professors get on so that my life was then easier. So I was, because everyone thinks you should work 100% of the time for them. And working in a different environment, and it was 98 to 2003, which, if folks remember and think back, that really was the peak of the tech boom. And if you look at the NASDAQ stock index during that time, it literally, in 98, it does that. And then about 2003, it's back where it was. And I remind people at this point, correlation is not causation. I had nothing to do with that peak, but it coincided with the period I was there, and it made it, you know, phenomenally interesting to be in the middle of the Bay Area, to be at Stanford, surrounded by people starting up companies. You know, I learned new non-scientific acronyms. I learned about initial public offerings, IPOs, about people worrying about their stock vesting, seeing an environment in which PhD students who came in and were doing PhDs in our lab and in sort of the optics and photonics area were very focused on their startup company that they were going to start when they finished their PhD and sell and, you know, make millions. Very different and exciting environment, seeing science and different aspects of it than the more academically focused environment. I mean, Stanford also was a phenomenal academic institution, but with a broader set of interests sometimes than I had been used to. And that was absolutely fascinating. And, you know, I think sometimes you feel you are where the zeitgeist is. If it's New York in the 80s or, you know, London in the 60s, it felt like it was the Bay Area around 2000, you know, and many of the things that shape our lives today were being thought of and conceived sort of back then. And so for me, that was a hugely formative experience in being at Stanford during that time.
You came back to Glasgow, and ultimately LIGO had this great success with the gravitational waves. Can you explain, I mean, I'm a physicist, but I don't really know, why is discovering gravitational waves going to change our economy, which was one of the things that was stated at the time? You know, what is the real impact, not just proving Einstein was right?
Sure. So detecting gravitational waves themselves is going to tell us about the universe in a different way, a very different way, and it does. The very first gravitational waves that we detected were from black holes colliding, where a black hole, end of the life cycle of a star, collapsed down into a region of space where so strong not even light can escape. And so if we look at the collision of black holes through electromagnetic telescopes, we literally, so far, we don't see anything. But we can pick up the gravitational signals, and so we now have information about a whole family of violent astrophysical events that we simply didn't have before. Our observatories are like microphones. They pick up the vibrations that are coming from these stellar collisions instead of taking a snapshot. It's a very different thing. That will tell us about the universe. Will it change our economy? I'm not sure the gravitational wave signals will, but the technology that is developed because these tiny changes in the gravitational field that we're picking up are so small, it pushes the state of the art in a whole range of technology developments. So, for instance, my group in Glasgow have taken some of those technologies and applied them in healthcare. So we have taken some of the techniques, again, about controlling vibrations, again, which is something that we have to do. One of my colleagues works with cell biologists who work with stem cells. Stem cells can turn into any cell in the body. By applying controlled vibrations to them, we can turn them preferentially into bone, which has applications in terms of bone grafts and preferentially growing sort of segments of bone to help people. So one of my colleagues who's now at the University of Strathclyde is leading that work. Taking our data analysis techniques, we work with companies who make machines to image the retina, and applying those techniques, we can improve the quality control of those instruments and the things that the instruments can do that mean more patients, thousands more patients in a day can be treated. So there's a whole set of those, I won't go through them all, but those kinds of things happen when scientists are pushing technology in unexpected directions. And you often don't choose sometimes those directions. You have to be developing new capabilities in technology, and sometimes it's the confluence of those coming together that allows for something new to happen.
But what's interesting there, I mean, you're talking about applications in healthcare.
Yeah.
So you've got the technology, but you've then got to go and talk to the medics or the clinicians, whatever.
Yeah.
So that's another step in this, isn't it?
It is.
It's being willing to step outside your own comfort zone, talk to people who probably don't understand a word you're saying either, and you've got to devote a lot of time to making that work.
Yes. And almost learning a different language.
Yep.
To understand what the challenges are that someone else is facing, and whether or not you have tools that actually can help solve those. But I actually, the older I get, the more exciting I find some of those other, aspects of what we do.
Absolutely. But it takes both confidence and the willingness to say, no, my techniques aren't applicable, because, having done quite a lot in the physics of medicine, sometimes you just have to say, no, you're asking something I know nothing about, go and find someone else, sort of thing. But presumably that is also part of the sort of motivation for wanting to get involved in the really broad portfolio that must have been being chief scientific advisor.
So it's interesting. So when a chief science advisor, for me, one of the motivations was, I think most scientists care about how science is looked after, how science is stewarded in the UK. We are scientists because we believe it matters, and we want other people to believe it matters, and we want other people to give the support that's needed to make us, able to deliver, the promise that science has, enormous promise. So for me, one of the motivations was to understand, how do governments think about science? What do they hear when we think we are talking to government and we are explaining what we do? What are they hearing? Is it what we think we're saying? What do governments care about in terms of science? We have our own perceptions about what we think governments are thinking, but really, what do they think? So, and throughout my career, I was interested in doing the science, but that leads you into how is science supported so that I can do my science. And I'd got closer and closer to the interface with government sort of working with the research councils, you know, sitting on their advisory committees, and then the opportunity came up to apply to be CSA for the Scottish Government, and that was a role that had been vacant for, I think, about 18 months. And it's the Chief Science Advisor role, either for the Scottish Government, for any of our governments or UK government departments, is an important one. It's an interesting one. It's typically a seconded role, so it's a scientist who will go in, sit in government, typically still though employed by their own institution, so they're an independent secondee, but work closely to help governments get the scientific advice they need and be that interface often, that buffer with different parts of the community who want to talk to government about science. And it so happened it was advertised after we had made those first detections, after decades of working hard and building our observatories. After we made that first detection, but before we had announced it, there was a period of 6 months while we examined with great care our instruments and our signals to make sure we were 100% sure we'd succeeded. And so a sort of space in my brain opened up that had been fully filled with searching for gravitational waves before, to allow that opportunity to take that step and thinking, well, you know, it really matters to me how, you know, that we have a great science system here in the UK. This is an opportunity to work with government, to help government, from my perspective, understand more about science and to help me understand what government's thinking.
But didn't you feel we've just got the first results and want to go on and on and on?
Well, partly yes, and one of the attractions is that this was a seconded role for 3 days a week. Right. So for the remainder of 3 days a week, I did my science advising job, and for the remainder of the time, I remained an active scientist in charge of as I then was and still am, head of the group in Glasgow. And it was important to me to keep, one, that connection with the wider community to understand what the community's thinking, and two, because you're right, it's incredibly exciting. We just had made our first detection, which eventually, of course, in 2017, there was the Nobel Prize went to for that first detection, but it was the first detection. Yes. And there's a universe out there to explore. Yes. And especially exciting is that every time someone has turned on a new telescope in the past, optical, infrared, X-ray, they see unexpected things. Yeah. And so in some ways, it's a transition point, but not an end point. It's the start of a whole new field. And so there's no way that I wanted to walk away at that point, but it did allow space to think about some of the other things that I think are also important.
But I mean, those are two incredibly different roles, and to compartmentalise, you know, 3 days a week, right, Monday to Wednesday, I'm in wherever in Edinburgh, and Thursday and Friday I'm back in Glasgow doing this other stuff.
So it's actually, it's interesting. It's less different, or rather, let me say it differently. There are more overlaps than you would think. And the other thing is, people do the job differently, and some people do it the way you've described. They say 3 days a week, I will think about this, and the rest of the time. And so I can't work that way. So as long as I answer all my emails all the time, then everything works. And so I did a fair amount of balancing, again, and both sides were flexible to let me do that. But being science advisor means you can take an interest anywhere science touches government. And so that includes not only science advice to help government policy, it's policy for science, the bit that I talked about again, but it's also science for society, which includes public engagement. And so actually, certainly at the start of my time, I spent a lot of time giving talks where I spent some time talking about the detection of gravitational waves and some time talking about science advice and science advisors and what science advisors do. It also helped, I think, that I work in a big international collaboration. I was appointed actually just about 10 days before the Brexit vote. So one of the first things that was on my plate as Chief Science Advisor was to engage with people across science in the UK of all types, industry, you know, working scientists, the learned societies, to get their opinions on what this was going to do to our environment, our international connections. So coming from a big international collaboration meant I had a particular perspective on that. So there were more overlaps, I think, than you might think.
You say that each CSA will do it in a different way, but does that mean you're allowed to say, well, I'm not going to touch that and I'm going to put my interests here?
To some extent, so there is and there has to be, you have to make choices.
Yeah.
Because
there's an infinite amount.
There's an infinite amount that you could do, and there are only so many hours in the day. So every CSA has to make the choice of where can I make a difference? What are my priorities going to be where I think there's something that I can get done, and where are the things that no matter how hard I push, that's never going to happen. So let's not spend time on that. You know, there's a certain amount of pragmatism. And then there's the fact that you can be, so there's proactivity and reactivity. That's the proactive part. Here are the choices I'm going to make about where I want to try and make a difference. But then some of it is reactive, and that a request will come for advice, and that is your job to source advice or help the government get advice in particular areas. So there's a bit of both. But literally, resources are finite, so you have to make choices.
You have to make choices. And talking about choices, why is it that the Scottish Government has chosen 4 women for this role? And as far as I was just trying to think, I don't think England's ever had a female CSA.
UK Government CSA, that's probably true. There are, of course, departmental CSAs.
Oh, yes.
Angela McLean,
Angela McLean. No, I understand that, but the CSA.
So in Scottish Government, I don't know now. There was a sort of pre-CSA period where actually it was Wilson Sibbott from St Andrews, the physicist. So Wilson was influential at the beginning. Then the role changed slightly, and it was Anne Glover, then Alfie Calder, then me, and now Julie Fitzpatrick, and all from different fields of science in Scotland. I can only say there is a rigorous recruitment process. So in each case, I'm sure they just chose the best person.
I'm sure they did. I mean, it's just interesting fluctuations in small numbers, isn't it?
It is.
I suppose there is the question, is it something that is more attractive to a woman?
So I think that's very difficult to answer. Again, I should say in Scotland there are other CSAs. There are 2 other seconded CSA roles. There's a CSA for these are portfolio roles, the Environment, Natural Resources and Agriculture, and that's Andrew Miller from Edinburgh. And then there's a Chief Scientist Health, David Crossman from St Andrews.
Okay.
So I'm not sure. And I think, as I say, everyone does it differently, and everyone brings something different to the role. I mean,
I'm intrigued also that the Scottish education system is different from the English education system, and in the context of there being 25% of women in your undergraduate physics class, I don't think there are that many in Cambridge today. Might be around 25%. Lisa, no doubt, will correct me. Lisa's nodding good. It's about 25% now, but I mean, it's crept up. And I've always thought that's partly about the breadth of the Scottish curriculum. Because, I mean, in the States, where you don't specialise in physics, at school, you may do it, but you don't specialise. And I think there are more women starting there. So breadth is something that I think, the evidence seems to be that more girls want to do a bit of this and a bit of that, and
I think that it's a very. I wish I knew the answer.
Well, I think it's your president of the Institute of Physics. You can look into this.
And we shall and are, and the institute is working very hard in terms of its strategy about being, as a subject, as inclusive as we can be, not just for women, but to everyone who. And I feel quite passionately about that it should be anyone who has an appetite to study physics can, and what can we as a discipline do to be better at making that happen. And it's an interesting topic, and it's very different in different countries. When you look at the proportions of women studying physics in different countries, they're actually quite different, and it tells you there's a real cultural piece.
Absolutely. And I mean, the whole attitude towards science seems to be inversely related, I mean, not just by gender, inversely related to how advanced the economy is, which I also find very interesting. In this country, people at, I don't know, 9, 12, whatever, are more likely to want to be footballers, celebrities, whatever, whereas in developing countries, they actually see science, I think in the way you see it, as something that can make a difference to their nation, or whatever. Mm-hmm. So there are all kinds of cultural things which aren't simply down to your chromosomes, to put it bluntly. But I think that this question about breadth, I'm fascinated by it, partly, and to go back to you wanted to be a journalist at one point, we should have scientists who can write, who can communicate, who, have these other skills.
Yes.
And we should have artists who can understand, I mean, arts scholars, I don't mean necessarily pictorial artists, who understand enough about climate change and, these wearing masks, vaccines, whatever. We need to be more balanced than we are in our education.
So, I mean, I think, the last couple of years, it has never been clearer the contribution that science makes to everyone's life, everyone's life. And I think and it is so important, and it's why, again, the Science for Society piece, I think has been undervalued, but literally our lives and our future depend on everyone's ability to understand enough about science, to hear the discussions about climate change, to understand the discussions about vaccination, to do the filtering of what isn't sensible, and really the bits that one should pay attention to. And that is a big, important topic for society, is how do we make sure that happens?
Absolutely. And I don't think this country is good at science, but I don't think it's necessarily very good. And I don't think scientists are very good at getting that message across, actually. I think too often scientists talk in terms of, we need more money. And you talked about the Brexit referendum, and a lot of the messaging, including from the Royal Society, which you and I both get involved with, was around, we need more money, not why do we need more money. And I think that was a mistake, basically. I think we do have to justify what we're doing.
Absolutely, and as I say, there's been no more on-point example of that than how vaccines have been so important to us. And I think the other thing we as scientists have got to be good at is understanding that we are part of the system that turns science into a change in people's lives, and all of that chain is important.
Yes.
Every single bit, and so we have to do the science part, but we also have to recognise the importance of the manufacturing part, and value all of that.
Yeah.
And talk about that properly.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I've just been reading Faxes, and one of the women, Kath Green, is actually a Churchill alumna, so I'll just sneak that in there. But that book absolutely makes clear the importance of all the work that went before they knew that there was going to be a pandemic. They knew there would be a pandemic of something, but they were ready, and I think that's an important message too. Just like your gravitational waves, it can take a very long time for a piece of work to come to some kind of completion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So probably I should throw this open for questions. If none have yet turned up in my Zoom feed, so it's over. Lisa.
So a lot of what you said, Sheila, has resonated with some of my own experience, but talking to friends and looking at the diversity issue we've got, which is a society, I do believe, comes from a lot of society influence. A lot of people have and the research shows that children have the impression that science is important, it needs to be done, it's highly valued, but it's for somebody else to do.
Mm-hmm.
How do we change that?
I mean, so I think the things that we tell children really matter. And I mean, I talked about at the beginning about the messages that I got when I was small. And as I say, I just didn't know any better, so I believed them. I was told I could, and I kind of did believe it. I mean, to the extent where I think back, I thought through the spectrum of things that one could do, and there's some things I was never going to be able to do, but I sorted through that list. And so it really matters what we tell young people. And That's hard because they get messages, of course, from a whole range of different places, and we often focus on school, but actually the number of hours that children spend in school is just a fraction of their day. They're getting a lot of messages from other places. So it's a difficult one, but it is, I do believe it's about the expectations that we set for, for young people. Where do they get that impression from, and how can we change it? And that's not an easy topic, and it goes right to the heart of, as a society, what do we value, what do we reward in society, and how we send out those kinds of messages. So not an easy answer. And if I had the answers to any of these questions, I'd be pushing for us to do them tomorrow. But I mean, I think that is an incredibly important one.
More questions? Or I'll just keep asking questions. Come on, you Zoom crowd, send some questions in.
I'm wondering, how was it the experience of being one of the first people, or first humans ever to ever see these gravitational waves? Did the collaboration talk about it, or just
Yes.
to?
It was an extraordinary time, again, and actually remarkably stressful. So you might think, I mean, Athene talked about the Eureka moment, that there was a big Eureka moment and we were all just terribly excited. Didn't really quite work that way. So literally, I mean, I remember where I was when I knew we'd detected something. I was in my office with a colleague and we were on the phone to another colleague who said, you do know a signal, we think, something happened, and we were like, no. So then we completely abandoned our conversation and everybody logged onto their computers, because of course everything's remote control, to try and understand what was happening. There was a official process that gets triggered when that had all been sort of sorted out in advance when we thought we'd made a detection. But it was a little bit complicated by the fact that we hadn't officially pressed the start button on the observation run. The signal came in, the detector was actually ready, but we hadn't actually officially declared ourselves running. So that kind of was a bit of a complication to start with. So people wanted to be 100% sure that, because we used to put in what we call blind injections. We used to put in test signals to check everything was working. So there was a lot of running around, like, oh, it must be a test signal. No, not a test signal. Turned out they weren't ready to do that. So the best laid plans, you think you've got a plan and then it doesn't quite work that way. And it took, I would say, a few weeks of everyone sort of checking to make sure that actually we thought we did really have something. And then it was very stressful because as scientists, as you can tell from tonight, we will talk to anyone about our work. And frequently, you can't stop people talking once you ask them. And we could only talk to people who were inside our collaboration because we knew it was a big deal and we didn't want to get it wrong. So we wanted to make sure we'd done all the checks. And there are 1,000 people in this collaboration, which feels like a lot. But of course, there was maybe sort of, 50 people in my department I could talk to who were in my own group. Some people in my group were not in the collaboration, and in fact, and that included everyone from senior professors to PhD students, and actually we had the odd summer student who was working for us, so we had to say to them, you can't talk to anyone about all these emails and they were brilliant, they didn't. Again, we had a room which had 6 PhD students in it, 5 of whom were in the collaboration and 1 of whom wasn't, so he didn't know. So every time for 6 months that poor guy walked into his office, everyone stopped talking. So he must have been like the most paranoid human being by the end of that 6 months, because every time he walked in, everybody went. So that was quite stressful. And then when you have a discovery that's a big discovery that lots of people have a stake in, you have to decide when you tell your funding agency, which turns out to be very quickly, when you tell your principal of your institution that something exciting is going to happen, which turns out to be a bit later, when you get closer to the announcement, when and how you're going to talk to the press, you've got to make decisions, and again, all of these, and you've got to write the paper, and every single person in the collaboration had the opportunity to contribute to that paper. So the editors of that paper have got 1,000 really interested people who all think they know what the word in line 4 really should be. So there was a system for managing all of that. And I sat in something called the detection committee, which was 15 people out of the 1,000 who were given the job of working through all the, double checking all the investigations that had been done. So 6 months sounds like a long time, but it was a month of frantic and stressful activity to get to the point of writing a paper, having that paper peer reviewed, because we desperately did not want to, send this out by press release. We wanted a peer reviewed paper, and because it was, an important scientific result. So it was a very strange experience, the like of which I imagine I probably won't live through again. And again, I learned huge amounts about sociology and politics during that time, as much as I learned science.
And what about when it went live? I mean, that presumably you could finally feel the excitement.
Indeed, but again, that was quite there was a press conference in the US. We had a press conference here, and there was a lot of media. So we did a lot of media that day. And my main memory from that day is relief of partly doing it, but also wanting to get it right and wanting to tell the story well, and being in London, sort of doing media, and knowing that I was going to be on Newsnight that night to talk about it, and getting a text from a former student of ours who didn't stay in academia and went actually into the finance industry, who lived in London. And in between doing press and going to Newsnight, he came to the hotel in London I was in, and we sat in the hotel bar, and he brought a copy of the paper with him because he was so excited to have been part of this early on. And he had a glass of champagne, and I remained entirely sober because I had to go and do more press later that evening. But that quiet moment of, talking to him and feeling his excitement was great.
Yes, well, these things don't happen very often, do they?
They do not.
Gosh, it's a quiet audience. Liz?
Hi. I'm curious about how you feel government listens, because I think there's been variable effectiveness of that communication, and just speaking as a social scientist, I'm curious how you feel, maybe what you feel proud about having achieved in that role, and what you feel incredibly frustrated about, if anything.
So it's a good question. I think, gosh, so in terms of what I'm proud of achieving in the role of CSA, so one of the things I did as CSA was, when I arrived in government, there'd been a gap of about 18 months, and that doesn't mean that government doesn't take scientific advice. It was taking scientific advice, but there was no CSA there. And realizing that for policy officials who wanted to take science advice, that there wasn't a sort of guide, if you like, for those policy officials who perhaps didn't come, even if they did come from a scientific background. How do they decide where they're going to go for scientific advice? And they were getting advice from different places. So the team that supported me and I did a piece of work where we actually went out across government in Scotland to all the sort of different areas that we could think of and different levels, and talked to people about how they were getting science advice. Did they take science advice? Where did they get it from? And put in place a framework, which wasn't just a document, but it was a set of activities to both top down and bottom up support a sort of identifiable way that if you were a policy official and you knew you needed something but you didn't know where to get it from, you could access those resources. And that was everything from putting in place induction talks for new civil servants. So when you join the civil service, you learn many things about what you do as a civil servant and how you function and produce policy. part of that is science advice is something that you should know about and access. And so induction talks we set up a network, again an informal network, of folks from different areas who were just plain interested in. Sometimes you find the secret scientists, people with science degrees who've gone into the civil service and they work in something completely different now, but once a scientist, always a scientist, and they retain an interest. Those informal networks, again, formed part of that set of resources, as well as, more formalised ways in which the policy officials could reach that advice, and that was put in place and actually got support at high level in Scottish Government for this as an important thing that Scottish Government could do. So I'm proud of that. In terms of how politicians, I think politicians have a tough job. They are elected representatives, and they have to balance any number of inputs in terms of governing and produce and coming to a final decision on policy. And so one thing I think sometimes we're not very good at as scientists is realising science advice is only one of those. There's practicality, whether or not something can be done. There's legal advice. You can't do some things because it's not a lawful thing to do. There's finance. Science might suggest you should do something, but it's astronomically expensive and it simply isn't possible. And then there's public opinion. In some cases, what does the public want? And I'll give you an example of that last one that really mattered, and that was smoking. When both of my parents smoked, smoking, you could have, it was known for many, many years that smoking was, not good for people. It's bad for your health. But it wasn't banned. It would not have been, I think, publicly acceptable at various points to bringing a smoking ban, despite the fact that science would tell you that it's, you shouldn't smoke. And it took a long time, and we did get there, to get to the point where public opinion was at the point where that was a publicly acceptable and supported thing to do, and even then there was a bit of controversy and came in at different times in different places. So public opinion is an important consideration, and politicians have to weigh up all of that. So from my perspective, the important thing is making sure that science is one of those things that goes in to the decision-making process, that there is access to the best we can do in terms of what the status of the scientific advice is. And the tricky parts are sometimes where the science is not definitive. One of the things we teach our first-year undergraduates is uncertainty analysis, and they always find it hard. And we sometimes find it hard to talk about uncertainty in science. So, we have to treat that carefully too, and when we put that in. So it's a package of all those things. So it's not, and the other undervalued thing is timing. Again, I talked about the smoking question, but when you put in a piece of advice really matters. There are sometimes you can put in the same piece of advice and it's going to fall on deaf ears because it's not the right time. There are times when it will be extremely effective to hand over that piece of advice. And so all of those things have to go into influence about how you exert influence.
Excellent. Well, we probably should let you relax now. I don't think it's champagne, but thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and thank you for being so open about your experiences.
My pleasure.